Hi there. Last week we got our first high-quality leaked images from that cancelled Game of Thrones prequel pilot about the Long Night, titled Bloodmoon. That they were posted by Naomi Watts' makeup artist, and we'd had blurry spy photos before, so this largely just confirmed things we already knew. Even so, seeing these high-resolution production quality images for the first time made it feel so much more real. That this really happened. You could see the millions of dollars that went into this, and it was for nothing. So it spurred a lot of discussion within the fandom about just how bizarre and weird this thing was. That HBO was willing to take a full loss on a $35 million over budget pilot. That was 3 times as much as the Game of Thrones pilot a decade ago, which was itself really expensive. That how do you even blow $35 million on anything? How did you let it get that expensive? Much less that the story details we heard about it were incredibly bizarre. So for the past week, we've been picking apart more specifically confirmed things we had heard about just how strange this was. And they said in other interviews, like Hollywood Reporter a year ago, they were trying to make it as different as possible, actively trying to do that, and they sort of got what they asked for. That it was intentionally experimental, bizarre, it was subverting things for the sake of subverting things. I don't even know, but all channels been going over that. Red Team Review, Preston Jacobs, World of Westeros, me, Los Siete Reinos has even been going over it for the Spanish fandom of just what the hell were they doing that was this bizarre. And I've covered this, that just a lot of these images of course focused on Naomi Watts because that's her makeup artist leaked it, but we've seen this weird stuff of this really Bronze Age Greek look for ancient Celtic Westeros, and the broader thing that they were shoehorning the Lannister origin story into the Stark Long Night story just for name recognition. That it looks really expensive, but also like this is some other show, this is some other universe, it doesn't belong. And the bigger thing is just seeing that these are in isolation. I said they're good costumes, just not for this show. And other bizarre things they were doing, and this doesn't even touch on, the casting leaks really lined up that it was utterly racist. That at the last minute they went, wait, there's no black people in ancient Westeros. Just cast them as children of the forest or something, and then say they got cursed into being elves or whatever. The casting leaks were lining up. So, point is, the past week, it just made it feel so much more real, seeing these images, and they pretty much lined up with what we heard about just the purely the Castley stuff. We didn't have complete 100% evidence for the Children of the Forest thing other than the casting sheets, but just how much money was wasted on this thing, $35 million. And this was supposed to be the future of the franchise. They bet the farm on this. And because it was such a disaster, we spent 3 years waiting for another show. This was considered a really dead franchise. But my point is, and the point of this video, after all that preamble, is we spent the past week going over how it was bad, not why was it bad, why did this happen. Behind the scenes, the people at HBO that made these specific decisions. And going through a couple of news articles that when it trickles out to the major news sites like winteriscoming.net and stuff, they reposted some interviews I had forgotten about from way back 2 years ago from that Tinderbox book, which was this self-serving thing that HBO put out, but because they're trying to make themselves look good, the outgoing executives, they actually accused other people of things we didn't know. By trying to shift blame, they admitted things we never knew. And the point of this whole video is, how the hell did this happen behind the scenes? And I won't fully answer that, but my hope is to open some lines of discussion, specifically by sharing quotes that all come from Bob Greenblatt, who is the guy who succeeded Richard Plepler as the head of HBO after AT&T took over, just as Game of Thrones was ending. So I just went back, saw some interesting quotes he gave in Tinderbox and a couple of other, like that THR article thing, of what the heck was going on, what was the atmosphere at HBO behind the scenes within this specific stretch of space-time at the HBO offices between 2018 and 2019. And to give you the conclusion up front, it was surprising that Greenblatt admitted in these interviews that 2 points: that yes, I admit it was badly rushed through production because we were trying to follow hot on the heels of Game of Thrones ending. And second, Greenblatt, as this outsider coming in from other, AT&T hired him from other networks, he admitted these HBO people were insane and irresponsibly throwing money around, that they had no idea how money works. So those are the 2 big points. It's just refreshing to see him here. Now, Greenblatt is not responsible for this in any measure. Again, he was hired pretty much as they were starting to film this, when the casting had already been done for months, when it was already scripted. So he's the guy who canceled it after he said, well, okay, they're already filming the pilot, as I'm just coming into my office and I have a bunch of other shows to worry about. Let's see the pilot when it's done in 6 months, and he saw it and canceled it. So he's not exactly a fan of this. But I want to go over all this in full. I was surprised looking at the comment sections from earlier videos. It's weird how people think of HBO as this monolith. It's made of people. It's not the HBO logo, the H, the B, and the O, talking like some cartoon. It is made of people as an organization. And when people think of organizations as these faceless entities, it shifts blame from the specific people who are responsible. I mean, how many times do fans go, oh, Disney hates this with Star Wars and stuff, when, like, these are decisions being made by Kathleen Kennedy or Bob Iger. And it's weird how people project things. Like, I even saw some people going, oh, well, I guess HBO learned their lesson and canceled it. That's humility. No, the guy who greenlit it, Richard Plepler, was forced out, and his successor months later, who was stuck with the mess, canceled it. That they said, well, HBO learned it. HBO can't learn. It is made of different people. And a major contributing thing to the problem was we came in at a transition period when the morons who let Game of Thrones get bad were finally getting the boot, but new competent people hadn't quite come in yet, and we're still dealing with the mess that Plepler left behind. So as an organizational behind-the-scenes history, I'm going to go over this quickly. The point was mostly just to share with you what Greenblatt said. But I've tried to make this video more than once, so I'm assuring you, I have to give you a timeline first, because when I try to give the timeline second after the quotes, it doesn't make as much sense. But trust me, I've tried this more than once. I learned from that. I'm doing the timeline first of just what the hell happened chronologically, that these are objective facts that we know about, as a refresher in case you weren't paying as much attention as I was. Now, the first big point with this timeline, as I said, is I have always said, and I still maintain, that the core reason this failed, this giant mega flop of a prequel pilot, that this will go down as Battlefield Earth isn't an example that actually got to theaters, but just this awful, how did this crazy Fitzcarraldo-like project ever even happen? I don't know. One of those famous unproduced movies like the other Man of La Mancha thing. The main reason this happened is because Richard Plepler, who was head of HBO since 2007, and who's the idiot who hired Benioff and Weiss in the first place and allowed them to thrive, Plepler knew by the time they were looking for prequels that HBO was screwed, that they were deeply in debt because he never knew how to handle money. His parent company, Time Warner, was going to get bought out by AT&T, so by 2018-ish, he was just looking to run out the door. And the one-sentence answer for all of this that I've given before is Plepler wanted to look busy. That I don't think he seriously intended to ever stay to see this through as a finished project. He went for the thing that sounded like the best soundbite. Oh, we're going to do a prequel about the origin of the White Walkers, and it'll have Starks and Lannisters in it. Makes for a good quote. But there's no source material. There's all sorts of other problems with it. There's no familiar locations. Versus House of the Dragon has a lot of source material. Arguably the most. There's more written about it than The Conquest. It's this interesting civil war with these two factions. But it makes for a little less good of a soundbite of how do you say, oh, well, it's this Targaryen civil war. Here's all these new names to remember, like Rhaenyra and Alicent. The Starks and Lannisters aren't really prominent until Season 2. Even then, they're secondary characters. That it was a harder sell on paper, even though if you took more than 2 minutes to hear about it, if you listened to the 10-minute speech instead of the 2-minute one, Dance of the Dragons is the top idea to start with. Just by source material, by the structure of it, it's interesting. Versus Long Night makes for the hype media thought, oh, this is a great quote, when I remember Westeros.org, their immediate reaction was, this is the worst possible choice you could have made. This is insane. Martin never intended to make a prequel then. There's no source material that I strongly think Plepler really didn't intend for this to succeed. He just wanted to look busy. And I'll cover that in more detail, but first and foremost, that's the primary reason. And spinning off from that, the timeline of how Plepler left and how HBO fell apart. Again, this is all provisional. I'm rambling, I know. There will eventually be longer, more detailed documentaries on a semi-professional level covering just how insane this was behind the scenes that led to Benioff and Weiss. It's related to that. But short version is Richard Plepler should never have been the CEO of HBO, but he managed to be there for almost a decade. Because the men who built HBO left. There was this big chapter break around 2007 when Chris Albrecht left. Chris Albrecht is the guy who built HBO as we knew it, that he's the guy who started the golden age in the mid-90s of Sopranos, Sex and the City, all of their original hits. By 2007, this doesn't change the fact that Chris Albrecht is a monster. He knows how to run TV content, but he is a monster of a human being. He assaulted his girlfriend. He's dating people who were, for the thrill, he was having affairs with other executives in the office. He assaulted one in full view choked her out in full view of a boardroom or something. So amidst this personal scandal, he quickly was forced to resign in 2007. They put in Plepler as the quick replacement, and he just kind of stayed. He was the CEO, but the chief content overseer was Mike Lombardo. And they were sort of this team that way, these two guys. These are the two men who hired Benioff and Weiss around 2008. Keep in mind, this is also right after the writer's strike that the studios won. So for 10 years they felt like we were invincible and answer to no one. That's why they made a lot of these stupid decisions. It's this weird thing of we don't have to listen to writers, and yet at the same time they felt paranoid that AMC is doing better than us. AMC got Mad Men and Breaking Bad, we didn't. And they were desperate for a hit, so that's around 2008 when they hired Benioff and Weiss. Well, finally went through to, okay, we'll order a pilot after like 2 years of discussion. And that just kept going on for quite a while. It's weird how in these chaotic streaming eras, the turnover on the heads of streamers is like a matter of 2 or 3 years. Versus the old days when like someone was the guy, the leadership structure could be measured in the scale of a decade instead of a year or two. Anyway, it all came crashing down by about 2016. Because Netflix was kicking their ass. They really just rested on their laurels and thought, we don't need to develop streaming stuff. We don't need to have content on more than just Sunday night. This is when I get to the actual timeline. Everything we need to think about, all of the shit went down in 2016 itself. That it might actually have been, I've heard late 2015, but it's either right after season 6 of Game of Thrones aired, or now I'm hearing, well, it's after it was filmed and in the can. So either like Christmas 2015, very late 2015 or early 2016, Benioff and Weiss come into the HBO offices, and this is explained in the Tinderbox book, and said, we've been lying for years. Since season 3, we've had no intention of staying for a full 10 seasons. We want to do only 7 and then make a pair of movies as a finale. And we waited to tell you so we could strong-arm you because it's too late to do anything. And HBO turned around and went, you idiot. You can't strong-arm us into doing something we physically can't do. We will never be able to do that. All you did was waste time that you could have done devoted to writing it as at least a shortened season. So this is one of the reasons season 7 and 8 were really sloppy, as they were supposed to be movies. Well, actually, season 8 was supposed to be this pair of movies that they were rushing out. They wanted to go do Star Wars movies. Point is, Plepler really didn't know how to run HBO, and they had a string of other flops. They were coasting along on their prior successes. They had a few other good shows, but like, notice that True Blood got bad as soon as Plepler was in charge. And no, we need to pander things. And he made a string of flops, like that Vinyl show, for example, was supposed to be the next Boardwalk Empire. It was really terrible. The real rot started also 2016. July 2016, Lombardo, the guy who bet the farm on that Vinyl show, resigned in shame. So it was May 2016, Lombardo resigned in shame. And he'd been the content guy for like a decade. Plepler's right hand. Then around the same time, Benioff and Weiss told them behind the scenes, you are screwed because we are out of here. And HBO had zero plans behind the scenes of how are we going to continue this as a franchise. Because they thought, oh, it's going to run 10 seasons. So, July 2016, we know this from the Hollywood Reporter article, is when they first started thinking about what is going to follow this truncated Game of Thrones. And they approached George R. R. Martin, and he told them the top two ideas are Dance of the Dragons and Dunk and Egg. And they wasted 3 years on all these other projects. Ultimately, after all the dust settled at the end of our story, they went with Dance of the Dragons and Dunk and Egg, and 3 years were wasted looking at other projects. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. That by the end of 2016, we publicly heard, around October 2016, that AT&T was in active talks to buy HBO's parent company, Time Warner. Because of all their bluster about, no, we're smart, we know what we're doing, you just don't understand Benioff and Weiss, we're geniuses for hiring them, they ran their company into the ground. Time Warner was one of the most indebted countries in the world. So consider that by the end of 2016, the people at the top of HBO really knew that they were screwed and were more looking for their golden parachute, looking out for number one and giving the appearance of being busy, than really continuing HBO as a brand name. This is like that thing from HBO's later Succession show, I think was written by people who were familiar with the old leadership as this screw you to them, that you really thought you'd last forever and you never thought of how the company would outlive your tenure. So, 2016, Martin says these are the top two ideas. They said, can we look at a couple of other ideas? July 2016. Based on their copyright dates, these 5 different prequel pitches were filed by March and April of 2017. That were then publicly announced, and you all saw it. May 2017 is when we heard. They said, we have 5 pitches, but we're not going to tell you what they are, and they're in contention with each other. Fair enough, and if you said, and a rational person could disagree, if, well, maybe maybe this show's too different, maybe Martin's wrong, maybe we should try out some other ideas first. As a sounding board, not the worst thing I've ever heard. And, okay, it took you 9 months to come up with pitches from a team of 5 different writers. Well, not a team, but 5 different writers assembled, came up with 5 different pitches that were formally filed by May of 2017. For people who were rushing, it then took them, a full year to pick Long Night? The Long Night prequel was announced as this won the competition a little over 12 months later, in June of 2018. That Plepler was very indecisive about this, if indeed he ever actually wanted to make it. Or if not Plepler, then all of the other people, hangers-on, other nameless executives we haven't heard of. I thought they'd be picking something by the fall when we heard about it in June. Instead, they picked it 13 months later. And I think it's no accident. Remember I said October 2016 is when they started the process of AT&T merging and buying them, because they had to go through all the legal red tape. Long Night was announced as the prequel pilot that won the competition on specifically June 8th of 2018. June 12th of 2018, 6 days later, is when AT&T finalized the purchase and when Time Warner CEO Jeff Books formally stepped down. So AT&T formally bought out their parent company 6 days after they announced that. So putting two and two together, it's they were so feckless and indecisive, even though they knew they had to rush, that as they saw, oh God, in a week's time we're going to have new bosses who expect results, they went, long night. I mean, just within a week of the new boss coming in is when they made that announcement. That cannot be an accident of when they chose that, because Plepler was both indecisive and I don't think he really cared what happened to the company. But from that point, that, oh my God, there's these new bosses, I have to look busy. From second half of 2018, from June 2018, the lead up to season 8, this is when we got casting news by October 2018. Spring, we saw they were building sets. The actual dates when season 8 aired were April 14th through May 19th. And the filming on that must have started around March, I think, because that's when we got more spy photos throughout the summer, but we could see them building sets like a month before Game of Thrones Season 8 started, so there was supposed to be overlapping hype for this. Of course, Richard Plepler resigned by February of 2019. Like 2 months before Game of Thrones Season 8 started, he bailed, because he did not want to deal with questions about this mess. And similarly, he also didn't have to deal with the mess of The Long Night started filming about 1 month later. So right before the real boots on the ground, the actual filming is starting, I have to deal with executives complaining from the filming of, you're not organizing this well. And yes, he's higher up the food chain, but you'd still see executives complaining about cost overruns and stuff. Right before it really mattered, he bailed. So there's this narrow window of less than a year, of about 8 months, from June 2018 through February 2019, where Plepler just had to look busy for the sake of his new bosses, and more probably so he wouldn't be fired in shame, but be more desirable when he himself chose to jump ship to go. He went over to Apple. He went over to be a producer of one of several. He works on documentaries for Apple now. Like, if he was fired in shame by, like, October 2018, he probably wouldn't have picked up the Apple job. That he needed to look busy up until the point he could line up a job at another thing, because being fired makes you look bad. So that's the timeline I think we're dealing with, and I know I'm 20 minutes into this, but a lot of people didn't keep track of this. That just within 6 days of, oh my God, new bosses, look busy. So, again, I've tried recording this more than once. It makes more sense to do this 20 minutes of setup first. What did Bob Greenblatt say? That when AT&T took over, they put Bob Greenblatt in charge as not just the head of HBO, but the head of the entire Time Warner family of things like TBS, TNT, Cartoon Network, and they really didn't have a good organizational structure. But Greenblatt was generally a responsible executive. He worked on a couple of the other broadcast channels for a long time. He turned around Showtime pretty well. He sounded like, a responsible guy who knew what he was doing, and as this outsider looking in, he just said these people are insane. So let me go through what he said. The 2 points are it was rushed and they threw money at everything. First, quote by Greenblatt about admitting this thing was rushed to look busy, and we need either to look busy or because they were paranoid about we need to get content out as quickly as possible. Quote, it was critical that we somehow continue the franchise and move quickly, which involved getting the series in production as quickly as possible. That always makes you bite your nails. I was motivated to get more Game of Thrones in the ecosystem. So yes, officially they were rushing. Now, they had no way of knowing a pandemic was coming, right? They thought they were going to get Long Night on screen with just one off year. They thought this would be on screen by 2021. Obviously, they were filming a pilot summer 2019. The plan would then have been to film a full first season in 2020 to air in early 2021 or something. So when people complain, oh, there's an off year, most major shows have off years now, because if you increase the quality to movie level quality, it takes longer to make. But consider just how Game of Thrones is cranking out things. It has to be out every 12 months. It's insane. And look how much people complained when there was a year and a half gap between seasons 7 and 8, when 2018 was a gap year. People couldn't handle it. They lost their minds. They were afraid of having any more than just one gap year. They said, okay, well, 2020 will be a gap year, but we'll be back. It'll be on your screens again within 2 years, 2021, when the responsible thing would be take 2 to 3 years off to set up a new show well. I've seen this on so many other franchises. You've seen this with how much they're cranking out Marvel shows. It diluted the quality. The general rush to get a lot of streaming content from the streaming wars has led to watered-down content. It's one of the things the strike was about, that you can't keep up this production level, or that you're just rushing content, or the Star Wars things that have gotten a bit of a hit, and I think they'll get better, but this is another thing that, like, this is why Star Trek ended in the 90s, that you didn't take a gap between new seasons from Voyager to Enterprise. The writers themselves admitted you needed to give us like 2 to 3 years to recharge and develop better scripts. You can't just, you have to maintain momentum. That's a mentality. But you saw that in the streaming wars. We have to immediately follow up with something else, when if you rush it, it's going to lead to all sorts of problems. Another point tying in with how rushed it was. Consider their original pitch for the Dance of the Dragons as a prequel was basically dive into the Civil War and all of the action sequences and empty spectacle. That Dance of the Dragons actually went through 3 showrunners. And the final third one, Ryan Condal, they have said is unrelated to the first 2. The original one was Carly Ray, who had creative differences with George R. R. Martin. Then she left, and they brought in Brian Cogman as a replacement. They didn't trust him initially. They brought him as a replacement. They didn't like his either, booted him out, had to start over from scratch. He himself admitted, credit, he said, I was so busy working on season 8 at the time, I couldn't possibly, they were developing this, mid-2018 was when the pitches were coming. He said, I'm working on season 8, I can't possibly devote a lot of energy to a good pitch for a separate project. So Cogman's thing was just rushed as well, but Carly Ray's original pitch that HBO seriously entertained for a long time, over Martin's objections, which eventually won out, that they got rid of her idea. Carly Ray's idea was to start when Viserys dies. Like, what you saw in the season 1 finale would have been episode 1. It would have read like the novella, The Princess and the Queen, which is when Martin was first releasing these as novellas, he released them out of order. He released The Princess and the Queen first in 2013. It begins when Viserys dies. But then the next year he released The Rogue Prince, which covers the 30-year almost reign of Viserys I, going over, this is everything from when Viserys was crowned, through his wife's death then and childbirth, and Rhaenyra then became the heir, and taking time for storytelling of this is how these 2 factions formed at the court, why they don't like each other, why they're fighting each other. All the story parts of this. And Martin kept insisting, no, you need to basically adapt The Rogue Prince as season 1. You need that setup. So consider within that context that it isn't, oh no, that's too much setup, George. It's HBO is pressuring for, as fast as possible, we need to get into the action. Imagine, there was no way in that mentality in 2018 they were going to accept someone saying, you need to go on break for at least 2, maybe 3 years, and season 1 of the next show will need to be mostly plot setup, because that's how story structure works. In any movie or series, like, most of Fellowship of the Ring is exposition compared to, well, you need that for a 3-part story. That's just how this works. And Game of Thrones itself, season 1 is mostly setup. That they were unwilling to accept this. So they went with the easy option, with the good soundbite, Long Night. But Carly Ray's pitch reflects that mentality of, we need to dive back into the empty spectacle as much as possible. The Battle of the Bastards is empty spectacle. If you didn't like the White Hunt in season 7, you can't say the Battle of the Bastards was good. They're both just meant to be action spectacles with no story. They just wanted to dive into that kind of thing again. Thankfully, those people aren't in charge anymore. And as I said in the other video, it's the fact that Season 8 and Long Night Pilot failed the same year is what convinced the new heads of HBO, we need to make a new contract with Martin and only make projects that he approves of because he knows what he's talking about. But we've already covered that. So Greenblatt himself says, like Plepler was obvious, there's two sides to this. The official story, there's no getting around it, is this was rushed. They were rushing to get something on screen. They wanted something by 2021. Behind the scenes, I think Plepler was rushing this into production, that he wanted to look busy in this gap from June of 2018 through spring of 2019, when he knew, I have to get out of here before Season 8 airs, so they don't blame me for it. So I look good when I'm applying to Apple. That, from Plepler's perspective, I mean, put yourself in his position. Would he, knowing since 2016 that Benioff and Weiss didn't care and were rushing the ending, he knew Season 8 was going to be bad. He knew Season 7 was going to be bad. He knew, with these new owners in place, I can't afford to wait a year while writers develop a new set of scripts for a well-written prequel. I will be fired by then. I can't just be inactive without a flagship show in 2018 through 2019. What about all the other HBO shows? The other HBO shows were flops. Succession hadn't started yet. That mentality of he needed to look busy, so he rushed it through production, which did overlap with the other executives who were not trying to run, but who were obsessed with, we need to get this big action spectacle on screen as quickly as possible. The fans hate gap years. Well, the real answer to that is, like Star Wars Marvel, you're supposed to have a cinematic universe where you have overlapping shows that you alternate with House of the Dragon 1 year, Dunk and Egg the next, or something. You can't just speed it up to, let's just put it out every 12 months. The quality will suffer. So first off, this was officially rushed, and I think part of the reason it was rushed is look busy while the changeover is happening to the AT&T administration. Of far more interest to me is Greenblatt's blunt remarks on just how crazy HBO was throwing money around. And this is something other people have said as well. So let me just read off the quote first. HBO was making a ton of money. They were making so much profit that they didn't look enough at the cost of the series as relevant. They thought you had to spend whatever it was, and of course Game of Thrones was on fire at the time, and it was a colossal success story. I mean, there was this mega hype 2017, 2018, that the media hyped it up even more. But I think HBO lost a lot of discipline at that point, because they did several very expensive series that either flopped or were canceled during production. I was never able to keep costs under control, because the order was not to bother them too much. This was a pervasive problem throughout Plepler's run, since he took over from Albrecht after he left in Scandal 2007, that we would hear this from like Kim Renfro, other reporters behind the scenes going, these people don't know where money comes from. Like, all they did was boast about, wow, look, this series, not Game of Thrones, it's something else, it made $100 million. And, like, it does not compute to them that you spent $200 million to make it. Or this show cost $50 million to make and it earned $50 million. Do you understand the concept of breaking even? That you are supposed to be having a profit ratio of 3 to 5 times what you put in to make a profitable show. Simply breaking even usually isn't enough to get a show renewed. And he's a child. All these people just, you think that, they're professionals, they know what they're doing. They fell into these jobs. They are promoted up from other positions when the leadership left, like Albrecht suddenly left. They weren't prepared to run this. They coasted along in the success of the prior administration and really didn't know how it ran. And the wheels had come off because the studios won the writer's strike in 2007. So it was this perfect storm of incompetent followers given total power. And they just loved spending money. And this is bigger than Game of Thrones. This is just this huge pattern. And therefore, don't take my word for it. It was so huge. The insanity of this new Gilded Age of what HBO had turned into in the mid-2010s. So this is weird seeing Greenblatt as an outsider looking in, that they had no discipline. They looked at their profits and just like... How many of you all know the trope, the cliche, of the musician who hits it big, the rock star, and then starts buying like 5 cars made of solid gold, and lighting cigarettes with $100 bills. And like Krusty the Clown in The Simpsons, where his accountant is desperately trying to tell him, you are spending more than you take in. That you could afford maybe 1 gold car and you bought 5. That when you see the crazy rapper, the crazy rock star or whatever, it just plays out over and over again of, I'm a millionaire, not a billionaire, you idiot. You spent all this money you don't have because you just stopped thinking of doing the basic math. And how it's weird how poor people know how to, working class people know how to, keep track of their money. It is offensive how rich people stop keeping track of their money because they think it's infinite. But you've seen this play out over and over again. And that's what HBO is like. When you're top of the heap, you don't worry about these things. This is how empires fall. Political empires, monetary empires, whatever. You've seen this play out of just, again, the Gilded Age comparison of, the money is infinite, it just keeps coming. Even when people are trying to tell them no. And that's what offends me most about this. While I generally defend Greenblatt, that part where he says, the order was not to bother them too much. Order from who? Order from who? Bob Greenblatt is not the head of HBO. He was the head of HBO's parent company. He outranked anyone. The only people above him were the AT&T people, who themselves were urging cost cuts. So, from one thing to another, it feels like we got these weak administrations who couldn't rein in their subordinates. That Plepler's answer to everything was, I'll spend anything you want, I'll give you a blank check. He has this whole thing where he goes, my job is to create a boutique culture, pampering these A-list stars and star producers and writers and actors, and in return they'll make great content. Well, that's a system ripe for taking a con man taking advantage of, that you give them money without question. Greenblatt similarly, and admittedly he's this new guy coming in, it was a difficult time, not just coming in, but amidst a massive restructuring, was not able to rein them in. So he phrases it as an order, but it sounds like it was from his other people. Now, again, old HBO is gone. Plepler was gone. The content coordinator, Lombardo, was gone. The new content coordinator for Time Warner as a whole, who was supposed to be the right hand of Greenblatt, was a man named Kevin Riley, who had been running Time Warner's TBS and TNT departments. Now, the other thing is that Time Warner was, like making buggy whips in the age of the car. They had no desire to make a streaming service. I remember them seeing it with contempt as late as 2015, because, Netflix thinks they can challenge us, and and they didn't even have an international streaming plan. If maybe we have streaming services in Brazil, we don't know. We don't care what happens outside the United States. Whereas Netflix was making not only a streaming model in the US, but going international with it, with a global strategy. They really didn't plan this. So when the streaming wars hit in late 2019, it was a scramble that all the old media giants were taken by surprise. Some managed to weather it fairly well. The case model is Disney went, okay, Netflix is beating us, they made this streaming service, let's plan out how we're going to build Disney Plus. We'll buy up Fox to give ourselves more content, we'll buy up all these other things, and then we'll launch Disney Plus fall of 2019. And it was a relatively smooth rollout compared to the Time Warnerverse that became HBO Max. Was just, they were scrambling. I mean, you notice they didn't really have that many flagship shows as soon as they started. It was get in as quick as we can, because everyone else is also trying to compete with Netflix. This is where things get weird, and I wish people would pay more attention. HBO Max was never HBO. They should have called it Warner Plus. And this is why they changed the name to Max. I think they should have called it Warner Plus. I've talked about this before, that Max might not be a great name, but it's a hell of a lot better than HBO Max, because as they themselves, the new owners from when Discovery later bought them, they pointed out, this is really confusing. People don't understand that we have children's content, that we also have Cartoon Network shows on this thing, and TNT and TBS shows. It's supposed to be the entire Time Warner corporate family. And by promoting it as HBO, it led to all sorts of problems, both in public perception and internally. So they needed to stop. This was never HBO. This isn't just an outgrowth of the HBO Now streaming app for HBO, but for that entire thing, for DC Comics stuff, for that franchise of films and TV shows, just everything. And it really reflects that they just did not understand what this thing was supposed to be. So the old HBO was out, but then the first 2 years of HBO Max, they didn't really know what they were doing. And it wasn't really until really Discovery bought them out, and yeah, David Zaslav might be really strict, but he has a plan. He knows what he's doing. He ran Discovery Plus well. He's the opposite of, in Westeros terms, I wouldn't go so far as to say the Maegor to Plepler's Aenys, but this really weak, indecisive guy who delegated it to other people and let them run wild, versus a strict, hard, in-control guy with, as Succession would say, that killer instinct, came in to set things to rights. But that first year was very chaotic, when they just scrambled to get anything on. Point of all of this is I also recently just happened to see an article in New York Magazine's Vulture TV section by Joe Adalian. I love his column, Buffering, where he talks about the streaming industry. This is from February 1st, an article titled Max Casualties, where he was talking about the after effects of the launch of HBO Max. These are marking on that David Zaslav just went through a big cancellation wave this past month. And he admits that while he thinks Zaslav is being too strict on a lot of other things, he says, I can't really say this was a bad decision. Joe Adalian explained in Buffering that all of the shows being canceled at Max the past month by Zaslav are shows that were part of the initial launch wave of HBO Max back in 2020. And many of these shows should never have been greenlit. So it's Zaslav canceling things that really deserve to be canceled. And why did this happen? Well, the actual quote from the article is, the executives themselves confused HBO Max and HBO. And it's that whole thing of, who's in charge here? Aren't you? That they really didn't know that Casey Bloys had been promoted up to be the head of HBO after Plepler left, but we thought Greenblatt was the one really setting the rules for everything as a subunit of Time Warner. What we didn't know was that his right hand, the content creator for HBO Max, was the guy really calling the shots from late 2018 through 2020, when Long Night was being developed. Again, I'm talking about the wider issue, though. And just this quote that Kevin and Bob, but especially Kevin Reilly, really wanted to do HBO kind of stuff for HBO Max, when the entire point was HBO makes HBO quality stuff at the top of the pyramid, the top tier within HBO Max. And there should also be like 2/3 of this should be like a food pyramid, TNT and TBS level shows, which are cheaper and not as good, but they're cheaper and easier to make and should have a better cost ratio. You know, like sitcoms and stuff obviously aren't going to be high art, but relative to their cost, they're supposed to be profit generators by having a high 2 to 3 times ratio profit margin. And Kevin Reilly was explicitly the guy who oversaw TNT and TBS within the Time Warner administrative structure. But as soon as he got to HBO Max, he tried to turn it into this alternate doppelganger HBO within Time Warner. That when they turned around, the executives looked at it, they said when HBO launched, now we have these two HBOs and no TNT, TBS level stuff that we wanted on it. That when you actually look at the stuff they made as HBO Max originals, things that went pure streaming but not on the HBO cable channel. The big example that Buffering uses is that Julia show, that the cooking drama Julia Childs thing. That was supposed to be a major awards vehicle on the scale of Succession or at least The Morning Show. That was supposed to be a prestige level thing. Or Hacks. And some of the other things they greenlit. No, this was supposed to be like the Sex Lives of College Girls they kept because the ratings were decent, but that was supposed to be like the next Big Little Lies. That he made this mirror universe HBO within the framework of Time Warner, and they didn't ask for it. Because he wanted to be... And why not just order HBO to make stuff? Technically, you outrank Casey Bloys. HBO is within HBO Max. They answer to you. But in all these codes, they just... From Buffering, they just kept trying to make HBO shows. And they said it should feel more cable-like, it should be more women content, all these... The quotes in here... And the whole point was it's supposed to be more than... The tagline was it's HBO and so much more. And then they turned around and just made HBO-like shows. And there wasn't this distinction between them. So while Kevin Riley had been in charge of content development December 2018, Greenblatt and him were forced out by August of 2020. Now consider that HBO Max launched in May of 2020, so 3 months after they were out of the gate, they got the boot. Because the higher-ups at AT&T realized you just made this alternate slate of HBO content. Now, Raised by Wolves was a great experimental show. And I'm happy we got it, that it was this Ridley Scott adjacent thing, that he oversaw some of it in broad strokes, he contributed to it. But fundamentally, this should have been like an HBO cable show or not at all. That the entire purpose of the Max originals is their TBS-like content, not this high-concept sci-fi show that would never have wide stream appeal. Imagine that they turned around and made this show with the budget of like a Westworld, and that they can't sustain that. So while I mourn the loss of Raised by Wolves, hey, if they hadn't put it on HBO Max originals, it might have eventually come out on HBO itself, well-funded. We'll never know. So, on top of Plepler left them holding the bag, the guys who replaced him were throwing money at everything. At HBO, at their other projects, treating everything like an Emmy-level show. And this is why we're seeing this cancellation wave now of these things should never have been greenlit. Say what you will of Zaslav, he never greenlit a bomb like this. Or rarely, I mean, obviously, people point to The Idol, but there's always going to be random chance and failures here and there, but nothing on this scale, nothing this absurd of the number of shows they greenlit that shouldn't have been greenlit, that were not supposed to be top-tier things. So it's all one rich tapestry. I know this is just a podcast here, I know I've been going on for 50 minutes, but for those willing to listen, there was utter chaos behind the scenes at HBO when Long Night was being developed. It's like senioritis, when the old administration is just looking to run out the door. Compounded by the people they brought in really didn't know what they were doing either. August 2020, they brought in Jason Kyler. And say what you will of how he got forced out when Discovery bought them, the slate of prequel ideas they came up with by spring 2021 were good ideas. Under Kyler, that they said we want to make Dunk and Egg, Nymeria, and Young Corliss, were good suggestions. And they had largely written House of the Dragon by that point. Greenblatt was in charge when October 2019, they said, all right, we're not doing after the disaster of... That was a fun week. The Halloween Massacre was around Halloween of 2019 when Austin Film Fest happened. Benioff and Weiss got booted off of Star Wars. Well, they announced they've been booted. They've been souring on them for months. And then, lo and behold, 2 days later, they said, hey, we're stopping doing Long Night. Even though Benioff and Weiss weren't even attached to that. Hey, Long Night's insane. We're going to go with a Dance of the Dragons show. By pure chance, because that's when the pilot was done. Pure chance, unrelated to each other, that the last vestige of that, again, Gilded Age means fake, that hype age of the hype fandom, like Watchers on the Wall, which doesn't exist anymore, of the combination, going into 2019, they thought, we're going to get this amazing Season 8, Benioff and Weiss are going to go and do Star Wars as heroes, and we're going to move on to this amazing Long Night show, despite all advanced warnings that there's no way it could be a good prequel, that they ignored, willfully ignored. And the vindication of Benioff and Weiss are out at Star Wars, and no, we are doing Dance of the Dragons, not some Stark Lannister. I think they just went with Stark Lannister hype, not because of the Starks and Lannisters, but because the hyped main actors on Game of Thrones were mostly Starks and Lannisters. Riding on the hype of, Maisie Williams, Kit Harington, and Peter Dinklage, when that doesn't transfer to new characters who happen to be from the same family. I didn't even know if people would like the Targaryens of Dance of the Dragons era, because they're not Daenerys. They're similar to Daenerys in some ways, in that they have very, fiery personalities, but they're distinct characters in their own right. And I like them because I read the book they're in. I already like them as a book fan. Just how much this changed. So Greenblatt is the guy who said, screw it, well, that's under him is when they said we have to start listening to Martin more. Casey Bloys, who had been the new guy replacement for Lombardo, gradually stepped up. And they don't, it's weird how they had so many, that old cliche of we have so many vice presidents and bureaucracy that it clogs things up. The HBO had a head of drama, head of comedy, chief content creator above them, who then answered to HBO's CEO, who then, in theory, works for Time Warner. They don't do that anymore. HBO is now a subunit of Max, where Zaslav is the business head of the combined Warner Discovery and Max, but Casey Bloys is the content chief at HBO Max. HBO itself doesn't have a content coordinator anymore. They merged the offices. That there is a head of drama and head of comedy for HBO. They cut out the middleman. Why do we need a middle position between head of content HBO Max and head of content HBO? Doesn't make sense. And the head of drama, for our purposes, the head of the drama department for Game of Thrones stuff, Francesca Orsi, she worked under Bloys for many years, so that worked out. That's the next person below him got put up a step as well now. She's head of drama, he's head of programming for all of Max, including HBO. We cut out a hell of a lot of middlemen. But just the corporate saga of how did this many bad decisions happen? I'm going to run this anyway. I know it's longer than do it as a podcast, of just how insane it was. Plepler's failures reverberated into that Riley and these other people also didn't know what they were doing. It took Discovery coming in to really reinvigorate that we have a global plan for things. Bloys is one of the only people still on from the old... He was head of the comedy division. He was unrelated to Game of Thrones at the time, so I don't blame him for anything. This was just a weird saga we were on, and it was refreshing to see these quotes from Greenblatt that I'd forgotten about, where he said, yes, they rushed this through production. I secretly think because Plepler wanted to look busy. And on top of that, on a broader level, they were throwing money at everything, money they didn't have. That we are not in the streaming... This is even in the 2010s, before the streaming boom. And then during the actual streaming boom, remember the heady days of 2019, 2020, when they were we knew they were throwing around money they didn't have. Everyone needed their hit, their Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, or Halo or something as their new flagship for their new platform. That ended in early 2022, when Netflix hit the subscriber ceiling and Discovery bought out Warner because they weren't making money. And I think, like Zaslav, for example, Say What You Will, has managed to get a leaner bottom line. Others, like Paramount, are just really starting to realize we are not going to turn a profit on this. This isn't just a bad year or early jitters, that we have passed the boom era. And for 15 years, these people haven't had to worry about where does the money come from. You have to pick good ideas, not just crank out a bunch of crap, and who cares, we'll make money no matter what. So that's just the saga of all this, and I know this was a rant, and if I ever wrote up like a book chapter on this, I know this is supposed to be like a 20-page article in a book someday by like Maureen Ryan or something, will explain it better than I can. I really like Maureen Ryan's book, Burn It Down, where she talks about things like this happening at other networks, not this specifically, of just how this goes down, and looking back on it, the news I look forward to the documentary on how HBO was run by morons who really didn't know what they were doing and were figureheads, particularly Plepler, that this wasn't, by 2009, this was not the HBO of 2005. And they coasted along on, well, we're the home of The Sopranos. After season 8, you wouldn't say we're the home of The Sopranos anymore. It's a different time. So that's just the saga of, I did this off the cuff, I had some notes here, some quotes of what the hell was going on behind the scenes. But then we have other questions, like they told Goldman to be as weird and experimental as possible. Even so, how much of this is Goldman's fault because they told her make it weird? Where did the Children of the Forest black people thing come from? Was there miscommunication behind the scenes? Was Goldman a victim in all this because they were telling her insane things that she didn't want to rush it out? Did the cast members will blithely go, oh, it was a wonderful experience? Or, no, we know eventually they'll come out like Ray Fisher and complain they rushed this through production, it was sloppy. And when you rush, you measure twice, cut once. Like the dialogue would have been rushed and therefore bad. You always make more mistakes when you're rushing. Just the whole banal cliche of when a project falls apart like that due to not taking the time and energy to do it right and do it smart so it doesn't have cost overruns. I don't think they intended to spend $35 million on this. They just had huge overruns. All of this is just tip of the iceberg. We're just scratching the surface on what the hell happened. But it raises these questions, and these are the questions we should be asking.